23rd of October, and I was seeing an article in the Telegraph about how Remainers had destroyed Boris Johnson's political career, or at least his prime ministership, and I thought, this doesn't make any sense to me. There aren't really any Remainers or Leavers anymore, but it's clear that there was plenty of Leavers who wanted Johnson to go. I think you can split the Leavers into three camps. There are the what I would call traditional Leavers, who are socially very conservative, but very Thatcherite, very liberal fiscally and in terms of monetary policy. So you think about people like Nigel Farage and Bill Cash and all those guys who were John Major's enemies, or the enemies of Maastricht in the 90s. Then you have the Leavers who jumped on the bandwagon in when the Tories came to power after 2010. They might be what would you call them, they're more socially liberal, still fiscally conservative. But people like Truss, David Cameron, they started off mostly as, let's say, Remainers, but they weren't maybe ideological Remainers. They were maybe more Remainers because they thought economically it makes sense. They're not particularly against the free market because they're not so nationalistic. They support things like same-sex marriage. And then the third camp would be the most recent camp, the guys who people like Boris Johnson persuaded to vote for Brexit. And those guys they continue to be socially conservative, to some extent authoritarian, and they're fiscally very centrist, even slightly centre-left. Those are the guys who who were from the so-called Red Wall. Those are the guys who Johnsonites think are what helped Johnson win the election. And those guys hate each other, those three groups. They are not particularly interested in cooperating. And so to say that the two former groups are not involved in the removal of Johnson is, I think, a complete nonsense. And then the fourth group of the Tory party, of course, is the traditional, what we might call One Nation. I don't know if One Nation is actually the correct term, but they may not be One Nation in the idea of a sort of Heathite One Nation, maybe, but they're One Nation in terms of the modern Tory party, in the sense that they are maybe centrist, both economically and socially. Maybe the Tory party as before Thatcher, and I think Thatcher is the dividing line here. Thatcher has been very divisive in the party. I think it's fair to say that the Tory party has really been at civil war since they got rid of Thatcher. Thatcher divided the party herself anyway, but she was so dominant after the victory in '83 that it didn't really matter so much. But the Tory party have basically been fighting since John Major became Prime Minister or leader. So this idea that Remainers somehow are responsible for all of the evils, I think it's a strategy or a tactic of a certain group of pro-Johnson and maybe more broadly pro-Tory commentators in the press, especially the right-wing press like the Daily Telegraph. And what they want is to continue this division within the UK between Leavers and Remainers. They want to keep the referendum fight going, and they want to keep the fights after the referendum, the fights that we had between the Tory tabloids and the so-called what's the word? Well, what they call the elite, the liberal elite, or the London suburban elite or whatever. I mean, I find this distinction ridiculous. I mean, for sure I'm a graduate and for sure I'm left-wing, but I'm not a member of any sort of fucking elite. I mean, you know, I'm from fucking South Wales. I went to a comprehensive school. Sure, I was lucky to go to university, but, you know, if I'd been born in that situation 100 years ago, I certainly wouldn't have gone to university. So the idea that I'm a member of the elite, whereas the editor of the Daily Telegraph is not, to me, it's fatuous if we're honest about it. But they want to keep this division. They want to keep this division between the Remainers and the Leavers alive, because they think that's the way to win the next election, is to reopen or keep open these divisions. And I think that it doesn't wash. I think that the British public is not, let's say, how can I phrase this? British public is not always the most informed. The British electorate is not always the most informed group of people, but on the whole they're not stupid, and they understand that the referendum is over. And many of the people who voted to leave, who will, let's imagine they're soft leavers, are to some extent starting to regret their vote, or maybe starting to doubt it, even if they haven't switched over to thinking their vote was a huge mistake. They've started to question it. And even if they haven't, I think, except for a very small core of populists who really, let's face it, are against everything and hate everyone anyway, and hate the so-called lefties, liberal lefties, whatever the situation. I think most people, the vast majority of people who voted leave, let's say 60%, are not interested in keeping this war going. They were never really interested in this war. Maybe they got angry when they thought that the Brexit they were voting for might be taken away, although I'm not sure how many really believed that. But it's since Brexit actually happened now. I mean, obviously before Brexit happened, and we still had the situation where there was the possibility of a second referendum or revoking Article 6 or Article 50. People might feel betrayed. People might feel the referendum wasn't being honoured. But in retrospect, it doesn't really look very likely that we were ever going to get a second referendum. Of course, there is sort of hindsight is 2020. But you know, sorry to say, but the Remain campaign, which still existed, such as it was after the referendum, was pretty bloody incompetent. You know, I mean, the MPs who were against Brexit, including Labour MPs, they were deeply divided in Parliament, but in both parties. You know, there wasn't really a Conservative or a Labour Party in those sort of 3 years between 2016-2019. So in retrospect, it doesn't look like there was ever going to be a second referendum. Of course, on the balance, you know, this is in retrospect, and it may be that there was some small chance. It may be that there was a 20 or 30% chance that we could have had a second referendum if we hadn't had David Corbyn. If, I don't know, the Progressive Alliance idea had worked in 2019. Who can say? But between 16 and 19, it was if we are looking at a realistic analysis, it was the Remain camp that was more divided than the Leave camp, and that's why this idea of a second referendum, it doesn't look like it was ever going to fly, really. Brexit has happened. I think people accept it as having happened. I think even people who are very staunchly Remain, like me, people who have a strong vested interest in the UK staying in the EU, like me, maybe we would love for the UK to rejoin. I know there's campaigns, but in reality, when the Lib Dems have accepted Brexit, in reality, I think this is something which is a very, very long-term possibility, and or very long-term project. Let's put it that way. And I think and I think most people who voted Leave, are not, you know, visceral, hardline Leavers. I think most people voted Leave. Most people who did vote Leave probably voted Leave on a balance of probabilities. They thought that the EU, it was a good idea to leave. They'd been convinced by the right-wing press, but they weren't sort of viscerally in favour of it. I think many maybe felt that they were being cheated when they were being persuaded that it might be lost, but it doesn't mean that they were viscerally in favour of Brexit or Leave. I don't think any of them felt it was going to be a matter of life or death, but now Brexit is unimportant. Brexit cannot be reversed, at least not easily. We may argue that we can rejoin, but rejoining is not a simple issue. I mean, when it was a question of cancelling Article 50, Brexit could have been reversed at the stroke of a pen. These days, Brexit is a fait accompli. It's done. Cannot be easily reversed. We would have to apply to rejoin. That's a whole process. It's a process that's going to last at least as long as leaving took, possibly longer. There's no evidence that the EU will necessarily take us. I haven't seen much evidence that the EU is desperate for the UK back, that the EU is falling apart, or is so this idea that we can reforge the divisions which existed during Brexit simply because so that the Tory party can use those to win the next election and rebuild the alliance. Let's call it an alliance or a coalition, which Boris Johnson sort of galloped to victory on the back of, I think is wrong, but also I think it's desperate. I think they are desperate. They know that their opinion polls are really bad, and I think that this is a desperate ploy by them. But I just really wanted to make this video just to say that, in my view, this is really a rather sad and pathetic sort of comment piece in the Telegraph, or maybe even more than one. There may be several. I've maybe seen a few different ones making the same or similar claims. But that's it. That's what I wanted to say. I'm in the forest near our house. I'm trying out my new little portable camera on a stick thingy, and I wanted to try it out, and so I came to this forest because it's quite early and everyone in the house is asleep. So if I'm talking in the house I might wake people up. You can have a look at if I can remember how to. There we are. This is the forest I'm walking in. It's just behind where we live. Anyway, that's it. That's what I wanted to say.